We're glad you're here. Thank you for joining virtually. John Isaacs.
Hey there, everyone. John Isaacs, Executive Vice President of Public Affairs for the Portland Metro Chamber, he, him pronouns. Happy to be here.
Thank you. And hold on. Let's play Steph.
Hi team, my name is Steph Rouse, she, they, and I'm liaison to the Portland Planning Commission. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. It's a weird week.
Well, I'm glad you're here. Thank you so much. And Kira. I think Kira might be popping in and out between meetings today. So that might be the delay on that. We have a couple of other, maybe just one other that I know of, changes, and then we'll introduce the many visitors we have today. Lance Randall, who was representing the Black Business Association of Oregon, has moved and left his position. I don't know if that position will be refilled. I think there's indications that maybe it won't. So that's a loss on our part, but I think that covers all of the shifts around. Any others?
No, I just would note, I think Benton Strong is traveling and expected to join the meeting later.
Oh, thank you.
This morning.
Okay, great. Sherry.
Oh, Sherry, yes. Sherry Duncan.
Oh, yes.
Hi, I'm Sherry Duncan. I'm a senior fish biologist and restoration ecologist with the Yakama Nation Fisheries, and have interacted with Bob Salinger on this topic, and just gonna kind of be in listening mode and get re-engaged with the process.
Great. Thank you, Sherry. Welcome. Okay, visitors, we have a couple in the room. We'll have introduced themselves and then I'll go online and then we can carry on. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, I'm Marnie Glickman. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an attorney.
Hey, I'm Sarah Silky, pronouns she, they, and I'm just interested.
Do you mind if we sit at the table, or do you want to?
You're welcome.
Oh, yes,
to
it's
sit
more
at the
comfortable.
table.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Tom Bullion. I'm with the Port of Portland. I think I'm officially on the TAC, but interested to see what's happening here at the CWG.
Alexis.
Hi, I'm Alexis Elias. I'm with the Columbia Corridor Association. I work with Porky. I'm here in person for CCA.
Wonderful. Let me see something. Debbie. Hi. You there?
Debbie Silva. Yes. Debbie Silva with Oregon Steel Mills. I'm a board member of Working Waterfront Coalition and Columbia Corridor. I'm happy to observe. I've been doing Portland Harbor work for 25 plus years, so also have that perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. And Susie?
Yeah, thank you, Susie Lawson. I'm doing a little work with the Working Waterfront Coalition, and I'm here to listen. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I missed one person, Haley Watson. Right, and I'll check one more time to see if Kara has tuned in. Thank you all for weathering through that. And I think before carrying on with the important yet very sort of mundane technical work we have to talk about, I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge Bob Salinger's passing and the significant loss, not only to this group, to many of you personally, and family and friends. And really sorry for our collective loss on that. And yeah, I really wish he was here today.
And this process was his number one process. Just let you know that he, at every talk, he said, you've got to get the EOA right. And I just want to say that at his memorial, you know, people came up to me, they said, we'll do the EOA, you know, with you and Sarah and Maureen. People just said, you know, we know that that was important to him. And so just want to acknowledge that, you know, people are stepping up to this process in honor of him. And I miss him today, again, all over, you know, being here without him has really, really been hard for me to even think about. So just, I'm sorry if I'm emotional, but it's just really, really been hard for me, especially around this process and trying to stay true to what I know he wanted. And so, you know, just devastating. So thank you to the people in our community who loved him, who, you know, who came today, because I really didn't want to come in here alone without him.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Does anyone else have any other reflections or thoughts about Bob you'd like to share with the group before we carry on?
I'll just say, you know, with Bob's passing and, you know, Micah touched on it. I mean, we just realized just what a huge role he played in the community and the policy work that we do and how many projects he touched here at BPS. And just the thought of trying to do the work without his presence just seemed really daunting and really sort of a void there that will take a while to fill and to honor his legacy.
And I guess I'll just add that I think this space is representative of doing things differently around the EOA process, around the community process in general. And I think we should continue to lean into that through this process. Like, this process is different than the previous one and the previous one. And it was because of his efforts to open it up to a more inclusive process with a wider array of stakeholders and to think outside of just the very focused economic analysis and goal 9 that it initially started as, but it has implications across all of our environmental policies and so many other policies within the city of Portland. And thus we need to consider those as we embark in this process because those economic policies have direct impact on housing, on environment, and we need to use that whole array of considerations moving forward.
Well said, Micah. Thank you. Thank you all. So hard pivot, and I apologize for that, but appreciate the moment to talk about Bob and his legacy and importance in the room. I'm going to start with just a couple of minutes recapping what the work of this group is, because it's been a little while, and I'm taking directly from our charter for the Collaborative Working Group. I'm just going to recap the purpose, expectations, ground rules, and I'll touch on sort of how I might facilitate today with the virtual and in-room participants. So just a reminder, the purpose of the EOA is 1, to analyze and forecast growth of Portland's industrial and other business districts. 2, designate an adequate 20-year supply of developable land for business and job growth. And also with that, align with the 2045 growth projections for the city with a number of policy objectives around economic development, shared prosperity, job creation, environmental protection, health, and equity. And as a reminder, the Collaborative Working Group, it started with 13 stakeholders. I think we're right about there. We might be at 12. Was set up to be a sounding board for the Bureau to review preliminary drafts of the EOA update, including a series of land use scenarios, policy choices, which we've been talking along the way here. And these will set our employment growth expectations for the next 20 or more years. Just a reminder, this is not a decision-making body. I'm not facilitating to get you all to agree on things and reach consensus. However, where we find those areas of consensus, we'll highlight them, or areas where it seems like maybe there's some agreement on some points, but that is not the importance of this group. The importance of this group is that we're approaching this as collaborative problem solvers. You all have various subject matter expertise in industry, labor, job creation, natural resource protection, climate, land use, infrastructure, and real lived experiences. We're looking for your perspectives and your insights to review trade-offs and understand complex consequences that are involved in this work. And also as a reminder, the expectations for the collaborative working group are to be active listeners to better understand other people's concerns and issues. You all do that quite well. Building knowledge of the EOA and policy choices together, providing feedback to the team on a draft set of scenarios and policy choices and draft evaluation criteria, which has been happening, and collaborating, as I mentioned, to identify those areas of common interest and where there might be some win-win opportunities. The results, as I mentioned, we're not seeking consensus in this group, but we are seeking transparency to eliminate the perception that the EOA is a black box. That might have even been a Bob term that was used. To gain a deeper understanding of the economic opportunity analysis and the policy or zoning implications of an adopted scenario. And your feedback, as well as others, will help refine the underlying analysis and evaluation framework of, does this make sense? What's missing? Common questions that we've identified. So the collaborative working group process presents two specific opportunities that we've been marching along with here. One, issue identification. The goal is to have an early review. You all help us with early review of EOA components and evaluation framework to identify wide range of issues and concerns that will enable BPS to adjust and supplement the analysis before a draft document takes shape. And then also identify those areas of shared agreement. We do have a very specific group of people who are community work group members we talked about, and we have many observers and folks sitting in for others today. I will be facilitating to have conversation directly with collaborative work group members. Observers, we appreciate your presence. We're super glad you're here and tuning in. I'm sure some staff will be available after meeting if you have questions or things like that, but we don't have other public comment. So thank you for understanding that. And with that, I believe, there's one staff update, sorry. Yes, we will do that before we get. But you've met Kryn introduced himself. Steve is retired.
Yes.
Any other project team updates?
No, I think
Okay.
that's the big major change. Steve Kuntz retired at the end of December. And then this is Kryn's first week, just finished his first week here with us. So, as our new senior economic plan.
So before we get going too much, and we could have done this with introductions, my apologies. Let's do a quick round among community work group members with we're calling an icebreaker, but let's just sort of get re-centered here on what we're doing. So question is, what are your two priorities? What would you like to see come out of the EOA process? And is my first Kate. Can I start with you? Oh, sorry, Kate. Sorry, apologies. Tanya.
Yeah, I can go.
Thank you. I'll get it.
So the first one is to ensure an adequate supply of industrial land to meet the forecasted needs, particularly for the harbor businesses. And then two is understanding and support from the city of Portland for no new industrial development constraints on existing harbor industries.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Sarah.
I wrote some as well. But I would say that just offhand that I really want to see that we kind of honor small business and that small lots, 3 acres and under, are honored, and that the land along the river, we have 100% riparian zone so that we can make sure that we honor the perspective of the tribes in getting baby salmons through the North Reach. Kind of a long sentence. That's all right. Have you had a chance to reflect on this?
I had not prepared anything,
That's
but
fine.
off the top of my head, I think one is the continued consideration of jobs versus acreage in our inventory. The goal is to create and retain industry and the jobs that they provide. And acreage, our past efforts to focus on acreage available just doesn't hit that goal. And so I want to continue to push us for that consideration. And yeah, I think the other is, so this is one side of the coin, and there's the continued conversion of industrial land by property owners to non-industrial uses. And that is a missing piece often in these discussions, but puts pressure to force us to secure more land for, through this process, industrial lands. And so, yeah, further consideration amongst this group of what we are doing on that side of the equation as well.
Thank you for the off the cuff ideas on that. We have quite a few of you online, but Corky, tell us about your top 2 priorities or what you'd like to see come out of the EOA process.
Sure. Well, one is middle wage jobs for anybody that is looking for one, but particularly for disadvantaged communities. I think the other is, particularly when we put a group like this together, we're all kind of forced to focus on our own group's goals. So I guess my other suggestion is that we focus on making an economy that makes Portland a better place for the other groups.
Thank you. John.
Yeah, hi everyone. Glad to be back together. So I'm going to repeat one thing I've said since the beginning, and then I'm going to add a little bit of something else. So one is, since the first meeting, I've said that I really would like us to look at alignment of this with the Prosper Portland's Advanced Portland Economic Development Plan, which was broadly supported 2 years ago. It identifies 4 key sectors that we aligned together and said we're going to develop growth and recruitment strategies in those sectors. They're all sectors that align with our economic strengths and our values. And so I really, there's going to be more work done this year outside of this room on the needs of those sectors. And so I'd like to be able to bring, their growth needs, what they would need, for land supply, those kinds of things to be able to grow as we've, decided as a city, we want to help grow. So that's number one. The addition to that is, we are the chamber and, I would say like the entire regional business community is deeply worried about our economy. Okay. Just deeply worried. And I think folks are it's kind of well known now that in our regional economic report this year, we found that the conditions that could become an urban doom loop are starting to play out here. Let's just call it a negative feedback cycle. And there are things at play that are just really not in some of our control, like long-term population stagnation. We're no longer growing naturally. We're losing population. And so the strategies that we're going to have to adopt as a city to kind of build the economy of the future, you're going to hear me as the chamber representative here talk about that more, and we're going to be talking with a number of small business sectors, since small business were brought up, about, hey, what would your sector need to grow to scale here, right? Like we have the most small businesses per capita of any large city in the nation. We have the ingredients to grow those companies. When you have the most, that's the biggest opportunity. So tying the things we hear from our current small businesses in terms of their growth trajectory to this process will be something I'll be bringing up more and more. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. And Amanda, I'm not sure if you've had a moment to prepare, but if you have.
Somewhat. With this being a first meeting, I feel I'm still in a space of learning and understanding the scope of work and the projects and the people currently involved in the working group. So that is a priority for today, at least. And then as a representative of the Watershed Council, the priority remains with people, plants, animals, and water quality in the slough. So coming with that perspective as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Steph.
I think I appreciate what everyone has said, and would love to uplift also what Micah, how do we interrogate what buildable lands and economic opportunity, what has shifted in our world that might shift what that conversation can look like here. And I also, from a planning perspective, and how do industrial lands and residential lands, how do we ensure that all goals are met at that interface? And how do we support the needs of so many different, like Corky mentioned, so many different stakeholders and needs that we represent? And how do we ensure that that we also safeguard that it is in harmony with nature? It's a lot of needs, but how can we celebrate shared benefit through this group? Thank you.
Thank you, Steph. And I thought Benton had hopped on, but I'm not seeing him.
He's driving en route.
Okay.
It's choppy,
Okay.
but
Oh, thank you, Tanya.
he did want to say that his hope is we write policy and invest based on the actual data and articulate an actual vision for the North Reach.
Thank you for sharing that for Benton. And Kara, I don't know if you've joined us yet or not. Ever hopeful. Okay.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sherry. My apologies, Sherry.
That's okay. So I forgot to mention that the bulk of work I do in the Willamette River is centered around Portland Harbor and the Superfund site. And I'm sure maybe some of you have seen presentations and whatnot where we have this concept of a string of pearls and getting habitat for salmonids throughout the corridor with stepping stones for those nursery areas and rearing. So as we look at this EOA process, keeping in mind the protection of floodplain and riparian habitat along that whole corridor for salmonids and other aquatic species. And that also includes enhancing and protecting what might appear to be marginal habitat and not look so functional to our eyes, but as providing space for rearing and migrating salmonids throughout the system, and just increasing those areas of connectivity of habitat and for them to migrate through the system.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I believe that is all that we have for work group members here today. So I'm going to hand it over to Tom. Maybe Tom, if you're sort of, is that all right?
Yes.
Okay. And maybe you can reflect on some things you heard about opportunities.
Is that shown? Yeah.
No. Moment, please.
So,
Yeah, there we go.
Good.
Yep.
Okay.
That's good.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. We just a couple of just sort of we wanted to recap the EOA process to date, and then update you on the project schedule and how we're going to move forward, basically over the next few months, and then ultimately getting to council within the next 9 to 12 months. And as part of that, we wanted the bulk of today's meeting will be sharing some project updates on work that we have been doing over the last 6 to 9 months that we haven't been meeting. And then finally, this industrial edge policy project is an emerging issue that we are looking to incorporate into the EOA, and Julia and I will explain more about that. later this morning. In terms of just recapping where we are, we went through a bunch of meetings to really help ground people in the EOA, and then we started to break down sort of the individual components, the employment forecast and the buildable land inventory. We've continued to work on those and update those with the latest information about the state employment forecasts and the metro regional forecasts that have come along. We continue to refine our buildable land inventory model. Sam will talk about some of the things that we've learned from the industrial land readiness project that we've incorporated into that buildable land inventory model. And then we've also gone through, especially focused on the industrial area, a series of policy decisions that we want to make in conjunction and coordination with this EOA work. And so, we've looked at the Columbia Corridor Environmental Overlay Zone mapping that Daniel's been leading. We looked at the North Reach and the floodplain regulations that are coming on, and Jeff and Juliet have an update on that today. We sort of looked at what was going on in the Portland Harbor Superfund and how that impacts the cleanup of that, and the liability allocation of that impacts the redevelopment work in the harbor. We looked at some tree preservation issues in the heavy industrial zones, which are mainly, again, focused in the Portland Harbor area. We revisited some of the employment trends around warehouse development, and also revisited sort of, dug deeper into the natural resource protection issues. And where we left things with you all was a series of scenarios. How do we take all of these different policy choices and how do they combine into a one, or could they combine into an outcome that eventually gets incorporated into the EOA? And so eventually that's where we're going to wind up by our July meeting, is going back and looking at those different scenarios, different combinations of policy outcomes that will help inform how we present those alternatives to the larger public later this summer. And to that end, the charge that we've been given by city leadership is that we pull together what we call a discussion draft, present the alternatives, do a broader, get out of this room, get out into the community, and do a broader public outreach process. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like and get your ideas about what that might look like at our June meeting. But to publish that in July, by the end of July, and really spend August, September into October getting community feedback on those policy choices. And then from there, we start what we call the formal legislative process, where we'll put together a proposed draft of the EOA with from a BPS standpoint, what we think is a good combination of those policy choices. That will go to the Planning Commission. They will have hearings and get feedback from the community. They will make a recommendation, and that recommendation will go to council. And so, we should be at the Planning Commission, by the end of this year, and that decision process with them probably carries over into early 26. And then once they make a recommendation, we'll go to council sort of in spring of 26. And we'll see what their committee process is like a year from now, and how to navigate that process. So that's a basic overview of sort of where we're at. I just want to pause there and see if there are any questions, about the schedule, where we're headed, before we dive into sort of some individual project updates.
I just, excuse me for my ignorance, but just curious, like, will the budget affect any of the outcomes of this, the EOA?
Possibly. Hopefully not.
I would say not necessarily in the short term, right? Like this is a guiding document, a policy document. What it might affect is subsequent to the adoption of this document, what kind of implementation, if we identify a number of implementation strategies, there may or may not be the resources, right, to follow up on some of those implementation strategies. Similarly, you're going to hear about the various studies that we've been doing and the investigation around, should there be more funding for brownfield remediation? Should there be more funding for infrastructure to serve industrial areas, those industrial, to remove some of the constraints that we've been talking about? Those require funding, those kinds of programs, right? They require funding, and they require, typically, programs like that require collaboration among levels of government. It usually combines things that happen at the local level with things that could happen at the state level, and maybe even harnessing, if they're in other circumstances, maybe like federal programs. So those are the kinds of ways, I think, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
That funding has a role, plays a role. To your original question, though, the budget, the city's budget, is not going to affect the production of this policy.
Okay.
And I just want to maybe just take one small step back and reminder. In the June meeting is going to be focused on all of the other employment areas of the city. We have spent a lot of time in this group talking about the industrial land, and for very obvious and important reasons. But just a reminder that the EOA is not exclusively about the industrial. EOA is about all of the job producing lands of the city. So, everything from the central city itself, obviously, to all of the regional sort of the institutional uses, the campuses, the regional job areas throughout the city, and then the small neighborhood commercial districts, right? So we really want to start thinking about the other employment areas of the city and how we can really, use those to accommodate jobs and to maybe make the pressures on the, consider making the pressures on the industrial land, somewhat lessened by being really thoughtful about the other areas of the city. So just really want to remind us that there's a lot of other conversations we have.
Thank you. John, please.
Yeah, hey, thank you again, John Isaacs, Portland Metro Chamber. And I kind of want to riff off of what was just said. So the one thing I would just put out there is, like today, there will be a letter to the city council with multiple business groups asserting quite confidently that, the city budget this year is the first of a multi-year fiscal reset. Okay, like it is very, very likely to the point of I'd be almost willing to say certain that the city council will be cutting the budget again next year and likely the year after that. Okay, the lost tax revenue from the city is not the kind of revenue that just comes back. This is like a total reset in our commercial property values. And so just saying that, and then also just as a note, I was on a call this morning where, the statewide business community is going to go to the mat to try to save the federal grant for the, Rose Corner Albina Vision Trust project. And, because the threat of that just being pulled back, even though it's a committed, obligated grant, the Trump administration is trying to take it away. So I just, to say that everything we look at here, I would encourage us to think about the cost. And I would just ask that as we get into those policy discussions, which I think are great, and I look forward to them, that we identify where we are doing the things that we're technically required to do and where we are choosing to go beyond them. And because of the cost, because it's going to be very, very difficult in the next few years for us to propose things that are going to add to the city's budget when they will be going through a multi-year fiscal reset. So That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the additional context and thoughts on that. All right. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Micah.
For the city council process, are you projecting to go from planning commission to land use committee then to council?
New governments. Okay. We're
All right.
ready to move on.
Okay. I'll turn this over to Sam. He's going to update us on two projects that these are more technical studies. The industrial land readiness project, brownfield inventory study.
Should I share from my
Yeah.
computer? Okay.
Yeah.
As you're pulling that up, let me just sort of set the expectations here. We have 80-ish minutes. I think we're going to spend about 15 minutes per project. Staff have been asked to give a brief recap of reminder what this is, how it relates to the economic opportunity analysis, have a little time for you all to ask questions and give your thoughts about that relationship to the EOA, and then we'll keep marching on. We didn't build in a formal break here. Let's see how it goes. But with that, I'd say online and in the room, please. There's coffee, and I think there's some water in the back. If you need the restrooms are down the hall to the left, and if you need some help, someone from BPS staff here can help you find those. And those of you online, if you need a bio break, please take it. We're just going to keep marching along here. So thank you, Sam, for waiting. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to talk, as Tom said, about two independent projects, but they're closely related and they're feeding into one another. They're both consultant-led. The Portland Industrial Land Readiness Project, and I might refer to it as the Pillar Project, might refer to it as the Readiness Project. I'll try and be consistent. And the Brownfield Study. The Pillar Project is being led by Mackenzie. Brownfield Study is being led by Moore Foster and Alonji. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the purpose, scopes of work, and the results, and how it's feeding into the EOA. So first, what are the goals? There's kind of a couple of shared goals for each project, but it's primarily and pretty simply put, we want to understand the extent of the issue. What is how much of an issue is brownfields in our industrial areas? We know they're an issue, but we want to get a better understanding of them. Similarly with infrastructure constraints. Use that information to identify some solutions. So, why are we studying this? Highlighted that, but basically, we know that we've been talking, as you all know, industrial land supply is very tight, and the remaining buildable land that we do have has significant challenges on it to develop. So, going forwards, addressing that will help us unlock some of that land, allow us to do some of the other things that we're talking about. So, we have half roughly of our existing buildable land inventory with brownfield constraints or infrastructure constraints. That is even more so on our vacant sites, right? So what we're looking at is more of a pivot to redevelopment, which is inherently more challenging than developing on vacant, comes with its own financial challenges. So that did update. Okay. So we're in the middle of the Pillar Project. We're just wrapping up what we call some feasibility work, and I'm going to get into that. The Pillar Project in green, the Brownfield studies in blue. We're coming to the conclusion of the Brownfield study, and then the recommendations that come out of that will feed into the Pillar Project. And as we move to the second half of this year, Mackenzie will be coming up with some strategic recommendations that will feed directly into the EOA and give us some good technical information to lean on.
So specifically, the Pillar Project's purpose is to analyze our industrial sites' development potential to grow the target cluster businesses and to identify the strategic actions to make constrained land more ready for development. We have three key phases of this work, what they call a short-term inventory, which is basically anything that's ready for development in the near term. We have a few partners involved in this work, including Prosper and others. So there's some other interests around like marketing sites, for business improvement and retention as well. The bulk of the work is some conceptual site studies where we're looking at what are the real life kind of market opportunities and barriers to development on specific sites. And so we're looking at infrastructure, we're looking at brownfield remediation costs. We're putting all that through a developer market-based pro forma feasibility analysis. We're also modeling some programs that we're calling interventions that might help with covering some of the costs of dealing with those constraints. And so that's leading us into, as I said, the next stage of work, which is the strategy. So talking a little bit about the short-term inventory piece of it, I won't delve on this too long, but essentially McKinsey identified a list of sites that could be developed in the near term using our VLI as a preliminary data set. They then gave the existing utility and transportation infrastructure a grade for availability and capacity, which allowed us to tier the sites based on the estimated time it would take to get shovel ready, basically. The idea and scope was to identify 50 sites kind of in that tier 1 and 2 timeframe. I note that this is, excluding any kind of consideration of permit timelines. So, let's say we have a permit, how long is it going to get ready to, actually develop? So the key takeaway here is that, we couldn't find 50 sites that were going to be ready for development now. That tier 3 still has 8 sites with 300 and something acres. So it's just a reiteration that our industrial land supply is extremely tight. As I said, the bulk of the work is really in these site studies. We picked 15 more constrained sites that covered a diverse range of kind of opportunities and site sizes and constraints, but generally they were more constrained sites. These studies that McKinsey did included infrastructure and site readiness work. And then we moved into this feasibility analysis to determine the viability of development in the current market. So, the interventions and incentives that we modeled were oriented around brownfield infrastructure. The intent was to show the improvement in the viability of these sites, or lack of improvement, yes, for industrial development, to give us a better idea of really what is what is available for us in terms of programs and incentives to advocate for or support. We'll be releasing a packet, but I just wanted to highlight one of the sites. This is just an example site, 11-acre site along the Columbia corridor. We have conceptual layouts. We have full development costs and the pro forma identified in this case, for an 11-acre site manufacturing. It's a $31 million development, and we have a viability gap of $3 million. So significant. And Johnson Economics, who did the feasibility analysis on this, looked at development costs, the revenue side of things, and ultimately, we're looking at what we call the residual land value on these sites, which is basically the amount of money a developer could still pay for land and have a viable site. More often than not, in our industrial areas, that land value is exceeding $15 a square foot at this point in time. So obviously if a developer can only pay, in this case, $5.88 per square foot of land, you're just not going to find that. So in this case, it's not viable. With the interventions, it's an incremental improvement, and these interventions total the total package of this is $700,000. So with $700,000 of incentives, it's still significantly challenged. And those incentives, as I said, brownfield infrastructure, those are not the things that are holding these industrial sites back. The main thing is the cost of site prep and the current market, in terms of kind of financing, lending, and just general. A big one here is understanding that the kind of the cost of demolition and on-site private utility connections is a huge barrier for some of these more constrained sites. And as we look at redevelopment, it's that's an important consideration. Okay, so the next steps of this is to take all of this information that McKenzie and Johnson Economics put together and come up with these recommendations. Those recommendations are likely to include things like actions to increase or improve the market feasibility of constrained sites, looking at infrastructure and utility improvements, some of the regulatory improvements that are coming through that as well. We already have some good ideas that we're exploring. Brownfield redevelopment actions, and then an important part of this next phase of work is also to understand the equity impact analysis. So what does it mean for middle income, low barrier entry, BIPOC worker jobs, and what are some of the benefits we'll get out of these beyond just getting general jobs and new development tax revenue. I'll pause there quick, just for a minute. Is there anybody have any questions? I'm going to talk about the brownfield study and then I'll pause for more questions. But if anybody has questions about the Hiller project specifically.
Questions about industrial land readiness. Go, Sarah, and then I'll come to you, Micah.
Well, just a reflection that in the North Reach on the on the east side, we've now seen 3 brownfield projects that are employing a lot of people right next to each other. The U of P, and then McCormick and Baxter is going to be a botanical garden, more than likely. All had entry-level jobs, and then we'll have Willamette Cove next to that. So that's just kind of 3 in a row brownfield projects that are, I think are pretty successful. I don't know whether you're examining those kinds of projects as well.
Well, it's yes, and bear with me. I think one of the things that we've been talking about in the TAC meetings for this project is we're now having a better understanding of certain sites that are just, they're very unlikely to be reused for industrial redevelopment in the next 20 years. And if that's the case, are there interim uses that we can look at? Or are they so underwater that we should pivot away from looking at them as an industrial site? So, I mean, part of that first bucket is really things like, lay down yards and storage. Like they still serve a regional purpose in terms of industrial and economic development, but they're not necessarily going to be, you're not going to put a brand new warehouse up on those sites, but they still serve an important purpose. On the second categories, I think is more of the McCormick and Baxter, the pivot away from the brownfield piece. And I think we're not quite there yet in terms of this work. I think that will be part of the thing that we talk about going forwards. But yeah, I hear you.
Micah, and then John, I also see your hand up, but Micah, go ahead.
Yeah, when you're looking at some of the constraints, are you trying to get a sense of how the sort of data gap or knowledge gap around like what the existing conditions are and what we need to mitigate those? How that is a key determining factor in leading to less development, and more importantly, like what the solutions for that is with the city better coordinating with the state and DEQ to really get a better understanding of specific sites and the due diligence that has been done at many of them over the years, but isn't openly shared in a publicly available way, and thus creates this obstacle that just the designation of a brownfield sort of holds off most prospective redevelopment just because of that uncertainty.
I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about the brownfield study, but I think yes, the kind of the correction of the DEQ data is an important step. I think what you're talking about is the kind of private actions that haven't been publicly reported out or captured in a sort of a public database, and that is a challenge that we've acknowledged and identified. I don't know if we have any good solutions for that at this point in time, because we've talked to DEQ as well, and they don't, I don't know where that data lives. So without understanding where that data really lives, if it lives anywhere at all outside of, going and doing sort of windshield surveys, which is something that More Foster has done, then yeah, that is a potential future action that we could consider, I guess.
I'm glad that's on the table because I think that, especially with the city leading with the state, to really, to share information that is there and prospect to find other information, whether it's by the companies that have been doing due diligence on these sites over the last couple decades. We've just embarked on developing our own brownfield, and we were like the 13th entity that had gone under contract to do due diligence on this site. DEQ had very little of that data, and I think it would be in the public good for the city and the state to find a solution to that in a holistic fashion that can create a clear set of variables that folks can really use to make a decision on whether to move towards consideration for a site.
Thank you for raising the issue and potential solutions. John, please.
Yeah, sorry, I'm talking so much today. I just wanted to say I'm really glad we're looking at underutilization. I would just two requests on that. It would be great if there could be analysis of similar characteristics, if there are similar characteristics of underutilized sites, both from like the site itself, but also from permitting activity, just characteristics on both sides, to see if there's any policy prescriptions there, and also just to understand the breadth of the issue, right? There's a perception that there's just tons of underutilized industrial land. So I think it'll be good to bring like the shared understanding of that. And then I just wanted to ask, are the proposals for regulatory improvement, will those be brought here for us to discuss and vet with you?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah,
That's all.
We'll bring the results through this process, and then eventually they get incorporated into the EOA document itself.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see Sherry had a related question. Maybe that's why your hand's up. Are the regulatory improvement options defined right now?
No, that's sort of the next phase of this work to help us identify what might be possible. And then we'll sort of, that becomes future actions as part of the EOA.
Okay, thank you. I have a second question too, and I don't want to take up time because I'm trying to catch up. But I saw the maps and whatnot, and I think I saw lines of a creek in a riparian zone, and I'm just wondering how the existing conditions and habitat and different buffers fit into this process.
Yeah, we used the existing E-zones baseline, but we did incorporate the medium just for sake of some of the conceptual site layouts. Like they're prototypical, right? They're prototypical kind of example sites just to demonstrate impact. But we did use the proposed E-zones as well, and some of the floodplain requirements, and incorporated that into the modeling.
Okay, so they're considered into the identification and prioritization. And when we talk about the regulatory improvements, is that a potential where there would be changes to those buffers or areas to accommodate?
We are not considering touching the environmental pieces of this as part of this specific pillar project. It's but they were inputs into our what we considered. I'd say the regulatory improvements that we're talking about are probably going to be a lot about like entitlement, permitting, thinking about
Okay, thank you.
One second. Yeah, so we're doing in partnership with the EOA a Columbia Corridor Industrial Lands Environmental Overlay Zone Code project. So we're updating the environmental zones throughout the Columbia Corridor and planning on doing that in conjunction with the EOA. And so I think Sam's analysis is taking into account the expectation that there's going to be some growth of E-zones on some of these sites. And so your analysis, and we're looking at a range of options right now. There's like a high, a medium, and a low scenario for how big those buffers are going to be, and you're using the medium buffers in your analysis to identify that. So you're kind of trying to account for those expected changes in the environmental overlays that will accompany the EOA.
Thanks.
Great. Let's move on to brownfields then.
Okay.
Thank you all for your questions and comments.
I'll try and move through this pretty quickly.
Okay.
It's, as I said, the brownfield study is a related but independent project. More Foster and Longyear leading it. And what's shown here is the public DEQ data. To your point, Micah, we use it in our buildable land inventory already. More Foster's first task was to basically take this data and overlay it with our buildable land inventory, and as a kind of an initial filter, right sizing some of the information, and then taking that and applying it to a decision tree matrix to get a better understanding of what the data in the DEQ, what the information in the DEQ data actually tells us. We were using it pretty uniformly, as I mentioned, and just kind of discounting capacity based on whether there was a DEQ point on a given site. But we wanted More Foster to come and tell us, like, what does that really mean? Like, in terms of, like, is it groundwater or soil contamination? What's the kind of medium? Based on a series of criteria that I don't expect you to read here, but they used that and they came up with a range of costs for potential environmental remediation that we could use in the feasibility analysis, that we could use in modeling some of the incentives to cover the costs of that sort of thing. And those costs range from $5,000, which is just a phase one to test contamination, to basically $750,000 for full design studies. So with that, they found that they surveyed 204 of our buildable land inventory sites, and that surveyed meaning they did the desktop review of the DEQ data, and then they actually went out and they did windshield surveys of those sites too. So drove around Portland, basically trying to modify that data to the best of their sort of ability and expertise, to get a better understanding of, like, what is the scale, scope, extent, severity of these brownfields that they've identified. So that is about 80% as well. That covered about 80% of the acreage of our brownfields in our buildable land inventory. A lower percentage of sites, but they tried to focus on some of the larger sites. And of those BLI sites, 43% were identified as likely brownfields with necessary required remediation costs. So anywhere from that 40,000 to 770. But given that it wasn't a full census of our buildable and minority sites, nor the brownfield sites, they extrapolated the acreage to identify the potential scale of the issue across the entire. And I think the key takeaway here is that most of our brownfields, if you look at it from with a cost range of 1 to 5, 5 being most severe, most of those 85% could be lower cost cleanup sites that we could more strategic about in terms of prioritizing programs or investment funding assistance to incentivize new development and cleanup of those sites. Here's just a quick map of where those sites are, the surveyed sites, including the cost range. Darker colors and red are higher costs, so no surprise that there's a more of a concentration in our sort of Superfund harbor areas, but lots of green, lots of yellow, lots of lighter orange, which is a good thing. So I think what this data has basically told us is maybe we were axing off a little bit too much capacity in our built land. So that's a point. How that's now feeding into the Pillar project, and then more forwardly, this EOA, is that we're applying, we're testing some of the incentives or intervention programs, namely property tax abatement, some grant funding, and income tax credit, which all in their sort of separate but related ways would help with the cost of environmental remediation on brownfield sites, and coming up with some results that we can have, so we can have a better understanding of what impact those things really have. And I kind of covered that a little bit already, but we're the next steps of Walt Foster's work will be to have a better, a clearer, give us a clearer understanding of what the kind of the fiscal benefit, what the cost is going to be, the benefit to development feasibility, the benefit to employment capacity, additional labor income, you name it. So there'll be a technical memo coming out very shortly that will feed into this, and I'm sure we'll report back on that as well. Yeah, that concludes my piece.
Talked about EOA as it relates to the brownfield project.
Are any of them also Superfund sites?
Yes.
Do you know how many?
I don't know how many, but you can see on this map, the Superfund shadow is basically, you can't see my cursor, but there's the Superfund shadow. I mean, we talk about upland sites, right? I mean, this is the upland sites in that Superfund shadow. We're not dealing with the in-water liability or anything like that. So, that's obviously an added complication to some of those riverfront sites, but I don't know.
But won't the sites, the PRPs have to pay for that cleanup? If it's a Superfund site, upland, they'll have to pay for it. The cleanup.
Yeah.
And I know well, I don't know about anymore, but there was federal money, to clean up those, to help those sites get reused. But maybe not anymore, but that was a big part of that program, actually. Well, I think it would be helpful to know which are Superfund sites, because then we kind of know that they're getting work done. It might not be as fast as we want, but they are getting work done.
Thank you. Corky.
And Sam, correct me if I'm wrong here, but just a quick clarification on the Superfund relationship. As Sam mentioned, this would be upland. We're just looking at the upland site and would not affect anything to do with Portland Harbor cleanup. And I'm not aware that Portland Harbor cleanup would benefit the upland sites either. I could be wrong about that. So the idea here, the long idea going back many years, is can we take the upland site, not remove it from the Superfund, but treat it as one cleanup without having to say, well, you can't clean up the upland site until you've cleaned up your in-water contamination too. It's like, no, the in-water contamination problem continues, but we can go ahead and clean up the upland site and put some jobs back on it in the meantime. That's kind of the idea there. So.
Yeah, and I think we've been tracking the where the Superfund is now as they're designing those cleanup projects for 18 different sites. For the ones that sort of have the most viable industrial uses adjacent to it, we're monitoring those cleanup designs to ensure that the way they clean it up maintains that sort of viable industrial use, especially sort of where you have docks and marine industrial related uses that you don't put a cleanup cap there that prevents you from putting in a new dock or maintaining your dock. And so that's one of the issues that we're tracking through that Superfund process.
Shall we move on to Daniel?
Looks like Sherry's still got her hand up.
Oh, Sherry, I apologize. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're discussing this right now, but I'm wondering, are you interacting and just talking with EPA about Superfund and the different institutional controls and the how this all will fit together? And it's true, they're in design right now, and then construction or cleanup of the in-water portions will occur down the road. But it seems to me there's some potentially, and I don't understand the full context and approach for identifying these areas, but I'm just curious if you've been interacting with EPA and discussing some of this with them.
We at BPS are not directly interacting with EPA, but we're coordinating with our staff in our Bureau of Environmental Services that is the lead for the city in dealing with the Superfund issues and coordinating with them. And that they are feeding us information about where we're at in the process.
Okay.
Directly and indirectly.
Yeah.
Corky.
And sorry, and again, Sam, correct me if I'm wrong here, or Tom, but this study really is to identify what's keeping these parcels from being used, and can we resolve that? So we're not at the point of talking to the EPA about cleaning up that. And to that end, I think, I'm not sure if it was Sarah early on mentioned, we've got, maybe a botanical garden going in McCormick and Baxter. Wouldn't that be cool? We got an impending cleanup at Willamette Cove. God, thank goodness. I don't really honestly see those as successes. Those things should have happened decades ago. My goodness, it's taken so long. And I think that's what we're trying to get at with this study to some extent is, boy, we've got contamination. What can we do to spur the cleanup of that contamination? And guess what? If we do that, not only do we get cleaned up area, but we may get jobs, or we may get a botanical garden or whatever. So is there something we can do to help move those along? Because we don't have a good track record in that regard so far.
Fair points. Thank you, Corky. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel. See if we can keep it in 15-minute range.
All right, we'll shoot for 15. Right, so I introduced myself earlier, Daniel Sobing, environmental planner here at BPS. I'm managing 2 projects right now that are all about environmental zones. So I'm going to talk mostly about a new project that has just started up in the last few months and is moving kind of fast. But we're also going to talk a little bit about the Columbia Corridor Industrial Land E-Zone project, which will be remapping the E-Zones throughout the project area in conjunction with the EOA. But this project that I want to talk to you about, the public infrastructure project. I make the slide. I guess I've got Teams to do that. Hold on one second. There we go. So the project I want to talk to you today is a set of amendments to Portland's environmental overlay zones. It's strictly code amendments. This is analogous, if you're familiar with the work that we do at BPS, this is analogous to like a recap project where it's just a regulatory improvement project. There's no zoning map changes. What we're trying to do is we're trying to facilitate the maintenance, upgrade, and replacement of public infrastructure and management of vegetation. So this is code amendments that will ease some of these projects that need to happen. And the reason that we're doing this is because public infrastructure is really important. We've got roads, sewers, water delivery systems, flood protection systems. A lot of this infrastructure that we have in Portland is decades old, is decaying, is in need of repair, replacement, upgrades. And so we're trying to create some code amendments that will allow that to happen. And specifically in our industrial areas, there's a couple of really big things that are happening in the not too distant future. We have Levee Ready Columbia, which is an upgrade of our entire levee system throughout the Columbia corridor. And then our colleagues at Bureau of Planning or Environmental Services are upgrading a lot of our sewage pump stations. That also are, a lot of them are in the Columbia corridor and are also environmental zones. So we need to have code provisions that allow these things to happen without too much regulatory red tape, ideally. And so I've talked to you before about what environmental zones are. We have a number of different flavors of environmental zones. We have the conservation zone and protection zone. Out at the edge of the city, we got the Pleasant Valley zone, and we've also got the river environmental zones. This project is really focusing almost entirely on the conservation protection zones, but we do have a few minor amendments that are just trying to make sure that the codes are coordinated with each other and have similar provisions. So we're doing a few minor amendments to make sure that there's consistency between the Pleasant Valley zone, the River E zone, and the conservation protection zone. But primarily, we're talking about C and P amendments here. The project proposals come in a bundle of four different bundles of amendments. So the first bundle, the biggest one, is this pump station and flood control structure amendments. And then we have some natural area management amendments, allowing for some types of vegetation removal and vegetation management, tree removal and replacement around Water Bureau infrastructure for wildfire prevention, also an upgrade to the way that we allow for a fee in lieu to be used for mitigation for impacts to natural resources, and then some miscellaneous technical amendments, just minor code cleanup things. So this is our timeline. This is what we're doing. We've already released the discussion draft. I believe the links to that discussion draft were provided to this group. If not, I can do that after this meeting. We've already gone through the public comment period on that first draft, and we're currently reading through those comments and using that as a basis to refine the draft and come up with a proposed draft. We're looking at next month releasing that proposed draft and then moving on to hearings starting in July. So again, this is a really quick timeline. This project just started a few months ago, and we're hoping to wrap it up by the end of the year, as opposed to the EOA and the Columbia Corridor E-zone project, which is moving on a slightly longer timeline. It's already been ongoing for a couple of years and is still taking a little bit longer. And so I want to just kind of refresh your memory on what the Columbia Corridor Industrial Lands E-zone project is. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, 3 different scenarios for updating environmental overlay zones throughout the Columbia Corridor and some other industrial areas in Portland. These 3 scenarios go from a kind of a low to a high in terms of the protection policies. All of them will protect all of the resources that are currently left unprotected in the Columbia Corridor. We know that there's a big deficiency, a lot of gaps in the E-zones. We've had an IGA with Metro for more than a decade now saying that we're going to fix those gaps, we're going to close them. So this project will do that, and then we're going to try to find a way to right-size those buffers to make sure we're providing adequate protection to the resources while also ensuring that we have adequate lands to meet our industrial job growth needs going forward. And then this is kind of a side-by-side comparison of the 2 projects. So on the left, you have the Columbia Corridor project, which is primarily a zoning map project. There are some zoning code amendments that are included in that Columbia Corridor project, but it's really a mapping project. And we expect that project will have some impacts on industrial lands. And so there's some potential for some regulatory relief that can be included in that as well. And as I said, we're coordinating this project with EOA, so we assume that the two will be adopted concurrently by city council. Right, you got the public infrastructure E-zone project, no zoning map changes at all. It's strictly zoning code amendments. Only applies to public infrastructure for the most part, and so it shouldn't have any impacts at all on industrial land development. So I'm mostly just bringing this to you as a FYI. We have this other project ongoing and making sure that everybody in this group understands that these are two separate and distinct projects, and that we're moving forward with the processes we've talked about previously. And so any questions or comments about that?
I think one other thing just to note, so as we had the package for the CCIL project, these code amendments were in there. We often, as we do projects, things come in from different bureaus, especially, et cetera, that aren't necessarily directly related to the project. And we had these code amendments, but because especially Bureau of Environmental Services, they have these pump stations that they're looking to upgrade and things like that. That sort of was the impetus of this separate. So we pulled out the sort of strictly kind of code work to try to get that through while we continue to work along. As Dana said, CCIL and the EOA are really viewed as sort of a package where sort of these policy decisions with the high, medium, low scenario are really, part and parcel with the EOA in terms of how the capacity that we expect for industrial land. So that will continue to go kind of as a package, and there might be, as we said, some code amendments as well as that in that package as it goes forward. But this is really to pull out those things that, again, were sort of more technical in nature to get those resolved. And we hope to have those in effect by March of 2026. We basically adopt code packages October and March. And so we expect, hopefully this will be through council and then go into implementation in March.
Thank you for the clarification. Any questions or comments about the infrastructure code project? Parky.
And there might be a better time and place to bring this up, but I guess I'm wondering, as I look at the definition of C-zone and P-zone, I recall, and maybe this has changed, that a P-zone exists to protect Portland's most valuable wild space, most valuable natural space. But when it gets down to the nitty gritty of it, you need to put some numbers on that, so 50 feet from a wetlands or, so forth. The problem that we face, and this is the problem we faced before the previous EOA, is when we're talking about older parts of the Columbia Corridor, where you have these old industrial spaces, that measurement extends over pavement, over a parking lot, and so the measurement is accurate, but to describe that as a P-zone that is protecting our most valuable natural space would be inaccurate, I think. I think most of us would say, a parking lot's not our most valuable natural space. So my question is, how do you resolve that? As we're moving forward at this stage of this game, those two things seem in opposition to me. I'd love some insight as to how you guys deal with that.
It's a great question. So the way that the environmental zone code works assumes that there's going to be a buffer around these features. So built into the environmental zone code, there's a transition area, and in most cases that transition area ends up working as kind of a freebie. So it basically says, this is the line on the map, but you can really go 25 feet beyond that line and build something new, and we're not really going to restrict that. So the assumption is there's going to be an adequate buffer space around all of these features, and if we don't have those adequate buffers, that means that development is really going to be right up at the edge of the slough or right up at the edge of that wetland. The disturbance area might actually impede onto that feature. Another yeah, go ahead, Corey.
Sorry to interrupt, but you're describing, sounds to me, the C zone. I'm talking about the P zone.
E-zone as well, yeah. Both. If you look at the zoning code that applies to the E-zones, there's both the P-zone and the C-zone. If it's the outer edge of the E-zone, there's a 25-foot buffer. A lot of times we have C-zones around the outer edge. The C-zone, and then the core is the P-zone. But if you see on a map, if there's just a naked P-zone that doesn't have any C-zone around it, the outer edge of that E-zone will go in 25 feet, and there's transition area. So there's always there's always a 25-foot transition area. And we build buffers into the E-zones. It's either a 25 or a 30 or a 50-foot buffer. But the outer edge is a transition area in all cases. And it's really a freebie area. There are some implications for industrial development because there's currently in the code a prohibition on exterior industrial uses in that transition area. And that's an issue where if we are expanding buffers onto existing parking lots and things like that, that becomes a problem because you can't use your parking lot for welding or material storage or things like that. And we're looking at that prohibition to see if it's too inflexible as it's currently written, and to make sure that where these situations where buffers are growing onto the existing development, that we're not creating a situation where people can't use the property to the fullest extent. But there are also exemptions for existing development within E-zones as well. So if you have a parking lot and you want to keep using an existing parking lot or repave an existing parking lot, there's no restriction on that. So you can continue to do that. And in most cases, you can expand your building into that transition area without restriction. We are still looking at where the buffers are on the lots and trying to make sure that we're not going too far, and we can do some site-by-site analysis to do some updates to the zoning, and we have done that in the most recent iteration of the E-zones that have come out. We've found a few sites that have qualified for a need for having a site-by-site analysis, and we're taking that P zone and converting it to C zone where we find an issue where it really could impact development. But we're hoping that the maps that we produce will both provide an adequate level of protection, adequate buffers, and still allow for those industrial uses on existing developed properties.
Is it possible for you maybe to call me this afternoon, because a number of things that you just said raise a bunch of red flags and concerns. So I'd love to just chat a little bit so I can learn a little bit more. Can you give me a call?
Great. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. All right, I'm gonna move us along to the next one. Jeff, Northreach floodplain.
So yeah, we just wanted to also, Jeff Cole. I just wanted to again give a little bit of an update on both our floodplain management overall citywide effort, and also a little bit more on where we are with the Northreach. We have gone through this in the past, but figured it'd be good to revisit and just sort of review all of what has happened since we last met. There's been a few things to report on. So in terms of our floodplain management work, just a reminder, we have, as a city, been responding. The National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, there was a lawsuit back in 2009 that basically said that the National Flood Insurance Program impacts threatened and endangered species because it enables development in the floodplain. A similar process and litigation had occurred in the Puget Sound. As a result of that lawsuit, FEMA had to consult per the Endangered Species Act. So as a part of that, the National Marine Fisheries Service develops what's called a biological opinion to evaluate the impact or not on endangered species. And it was determined that the flood insurance program has an impact on 16 steelhead and salmon species, and then also the orca that depend on them. So we had been preparing for that. Since then, as soon as it was released, we really got together a cross-bureau, inter-bureau team to respond, and have been working toward sort of responding to that biological opinion. Believe it or not, in 2021, took 5 years before FEMA developed what they call their implementation plan, which is how they expect to respond to these different requirements. And it is currently undergoing the National Environmental Policy Act review. We are a cooperating agency with FEMA on that, so we have seen some of the preliminary documents, us and other jurisdictions, et cetera. But it looks like it's about to be released within the next few months. But basically kind of a quick summary of what's in there. There's basically close to the river. There are additional requirements for habitat improvements and basically not just meeting where your impact is offset, sort of what we call a no net loss, but really improvements upon there. So it's kind of above what we currently require in our code, but that's essentially within the 170. It is 170 feet, and it's with of ordinary high water. And if the floodplain doesn't go 170 feet, it's focused on just that area that is closest to the river. We have been working through different projects, and I'll show you the timeline to really apply environmental zones to all of the floodplains that are vegetated. That's where we're really focusing the efforts to make sure that there is that no net loss. So we're basically replacing trees and managing floodplain functions. And then also, as it says here, the third item is really making sure that we've across the city minimum tree replacement that is consistent with the biological opinion requirements. So this sort of lays out the timeline. So FEMA has been working toward a compliance deadline. Once they finish their the NEPA review, which, like I said, the draft is set to come out now. There will be the expectation is that all the jurisdictions, over 250 jurisdictions, will be subject to this biological opinion, or are subject to the biological opinion. But anyhow, those jurisdictions will have 18 to 24 months to come into compliance, and that's that latter part. We have been to the right there in the blue line. We have been working toward that as our kind of looking at a long-term process. And this the bottom graphic shows in the orange is more kind of regulatory updates, so our zoning code updates, and then green is our building regulations, because these things that are required per the biological opinion fall with both in the zoning code and also sort of flood storage, which is how you keep capacity for floodwaters along with development is within the building code or building regulations, Title 24. So we have been going through this process with an eye to be compliant once everything is in order, because we regulate different areas in different ways. And we had been working toward that. There's these first two phases, the River Plan South Reach and the Floodplain Resilience Plan were adopted in 2020 and 2023 respectively, along with in 2023 some Title 24 building regulation updates related to the flood storage. We also have this other work that's sort of citywide and largely driven by environmental services thus far, looking at mitigation banking as an option for offsite mitigation, but also floodplain restoration to contribute to the improvement for those 16 species. Just a quick review of what we have done. So we really initially worked in the Southeast, like I said, 2020, and then largely beyond that, the first step is in 2020, and then there were some changes in the central city, and then largely actually may not be shown here, but in Fano Creek and Tryon Creek, we made some changes in the zoning code. Those are relatively minor, low density residential development, et cetera. And then the next phase, which is really both through the CCIL project, the Columbia Corridor project, and the North Reach project, we will be, and they were identified on that graphic, that we'll be incorporating, although these projects both have other issues that they're addressing, and we'll talk about the North Reach specifically here, but they have other things that we're addressing in terms of all these policy decisions. They will also incorporate the floodplain requirements and get us to where then once those two projects are done, it's Johnson Creek that remains for updates. In the interim, since we last met, which really, I guess we were first notified in July, although we were working to figure out how we were going to respond. And we understand these pre-implementation compliance measures really were a result of a second lawsuit against FEMA, saying essentially that it's taking too long for implementation. Like that FEMA did get I didn't mention, but they got a 3-year extension. FEMA got a 3-year extension from Congress, which sort of pushed the timeline out a little bit and where the 2027 was really estimated. But through this lawsuit, it was determined that the argument was that it had been taken too long, and there was take of these species happening in the interim before these long-term compliance measures are implemented. So FEMA now has what is called the pre-implementation compliance measures. And we had three options as to how to respond. They have a model ordinance, which basically is like model code that you can incorporate into your requirements. Do a permit by permit assessment. So where someone would come in, depending on individual projects, and the city would be responsible for evaluating impacts or just prohibiting floodplain development. We came to the conclusion that 1 and 2 were basically the same because it came back down to a table, which I will show you here, that just said you had to do the same thing, whether you did a permit by permit or implemented the model code. And so we are looking to implement that model code in areas where we have not made changes in the past from our within that long-term compliance schedule. We did begin tracking some additional data that's related to the biological opinion, tree replacement and flood storage, et cetera, more detailed tracking of that in January 1st. And for jurisdictions that are going to use the model ordinance, essentially we are, again, for portions of the city where we haven't made changes, we need to have that in place by July 31st this year. So we won't go into the details of this table, but essentially this is the table that really lays out the mitigation that is required per the pre-implementation compliance measures. And so the take home is the closer you are, still that 170 feet, there are higher ratios of both where you have to offset any placement of fill or buildings, et cetera, in the floodplain. So if you can see the first one, 2 to 1. If you're outside of that 170 feet, it's 1 to 1. So twice as much excavation as placement of fill, if you think about it from a volume perspective. And then trees, depending on how large the tree removal is. And again, if you're in that 170 feet, you have a higher replacement ratio than outside of that 170 feet. There is this other piece down there toward the middle that's called beneficial gain, where essentially there's an expectation of that improvement within 170 feet, but more on the habitat side. And so these requirements do include a 5% dedication of sort of additional mitigation area beyond the baseline requirements in that 170 feet. And so related to these, Planet Permitting and Development is really overseeing this because it will be implemented through the building regulations, Title 24. They released, which we don't normally do for building regulation, that's the building code. They did release a draft for public comment, which was in March for the 3-week review period. They are set with our assistance, so it's set to go to City Council, and they will be at the Land Use, Climate Resilience and Land Use Committee May 29th, and then go to the full City Council once it makes it through committee. Depends on how long it takes and all of that, but we expect that's in June. And again, with the target of having it adopted by July 31st and implemented. So really what it means is within that overall timeline, there is this period where those pre-implementation compliance measures will be in effect until we finish all of our long-term compliance. And again, at the end of this, the idea, not again, because I didn't mention it, but at the end of all of this, the city has to submit a package that says, for our long-term compliance, it says, through all of these things that we've been doing, the regulations that we've applied, floodplain restoration, mitigation banks, et cetera, we are compliant with the Endangered Species Act per the biological opinion. So that's really the long-term piece. So it can have kind of a community-wide approach. The pre-implementation compliance measures are very prescriptive, and so we are implementing those. And so essentially that's in the North Reach, in the industrial lands of the Columbia Corridor, Johnson Creek, and basically if you're not in the environmental zone for Johnson Creek, and some impacts of the flood storage in Tryon Creek, which again is low density and more residential. So with that as the context, just quickly the work that we've done in the North Reach. I mean, the overall aims are really, we're looking to, as a part of this project, engage interested parties. We know there are different perspectives, both from the community and the industrial interest. We want to recognize the area's role in the city as it's the marine industrial hub. And currently, as most of you are aware, the Greenway overlay zone that we apply there expects that it is river dependent, river related industrial. We're also looking to update requirements and processes for clarity and certainty. Currently, right now, everything goes through land use review and is subject to guidelines, design guidelines that were developed in 1988 or adopted in 1988. So hoping that we can have some quicker approval through standards rather than land use review. And then also implementing environmental regulations that are consistent with elsewhere in the city. Really just quickly, we will be in addition to that, those two pieces, first, the industrial and economic development as that key piece, and then environmental regulations, but then also, as we talked about, like the floodplain, all these floodplain background will also be incorporated into the requirements in the North Reach. So just quickly, the scenarios that we're sort of looking at, I mean, essentially the difference is the question of the river setback. So development is required to set back currently 25 feet throughout the North Reach. We have a scenario where we maintain that 25 feet for industrial lands. And then everywhere else we apply 50 feet. And then the second scenario is 50 feet is for all uses, for all zones. No matter what the setback is, as I think we talked about in the past, river dependent and river related uses are always allowed in that setback. It's only the things that don't have to be by the river that cannot be in the setback. Down there at the bottom, both scenarios, just in terms of where we apply the river environmental, it will be in the setback in that 170 feet that we talked about that's related to the biological opinion. And then really a benefit of this approach is that the river environmental will be placed on what we understand as natural resources, whereas right now we don't do that through the Greenway overlay zone. It's very much focused on the riparian area, et cetera. So we will be clear on where those resources are. So we do somewhat similar to the industrial land readiness study. We have contracted with an economic consultant to start to understand the economic implications of meeting those floodplain requirements. And I guess one thing to note is when we're evaluating the long term, more similar to what we've done elsewhere in the city rather than what is the pre-petition compliance measures. We aren't evaluating those implications. We're really looking at what we have done and what we expect to apply. Similar to elsewhere in the city. But in really looking at what is the additional cost that we would expect to meet these floodplain requirements. And then we've also continued to be doing existing conditions reviews, so demographics, housing, industry and business data, just to kind of characterize what's there as we prepare for a more public facing work. We've also, similar to what was discussed about the CCL project, gone through our natural resource layer in the North Reach, looked at different sites. And just to make sure, and largely a lot of it from our discussions in our previous sessions for the North Reach, just any issues that we see related to where that layer identified resources. So just next steps, the next step for us will be to offer the ability for a site visit to confirm those natural resource layers, make sure it's accurate, compared to what people think for individual property owners. Continue to gather information so we know the project scoping. Of course, there might be other issues that come up that people are interested in discussing about for the North Reach, and then beyond those three: industrial, environmental, and floodplain. And then we're working on a community engagement plan and then public outreach in the coming months. So that is all. So
thank you, Jeff. That's all.
It's a lot, but yes, it's the end of it.
Thank you. Any questions about the interim code or long-term implementation package?
Well, it's too much to talk about in a short sentence, but I know that you got the lawyer's opinion on you got that letter from those lawyers on how they felt about the floodplain, and I'm assuming you'll have to address that at some point.
What lawyers are you referring to?
I think they were the lawyers that first went to FEMA, is my understanding, and
no,
they gave you feedback.
We did not get feedback from lawyers, although there is a separate, I think you're referring to, the Oregonians for Floodplain Protection have also brought a suit to FEMA to say they think the pickums should not be implemented. We know that that is going. And are you speaking of?
Yeah.
We saw a letter from 4 lawyers.
Oh, you're saying,
To what?
oh,
Floodplain.
the same folks who brought the second.
Yeah,
lawsuit.
yeah.
Yes, for PP&D. Not, yeah, that wasn't for permitting development in terms of the pickup response. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So anyway, and then, for sure, in terms of the North Reach, we'll probably be working on, a project that super engages, the community on what they want, because the North Reach is obviously a community. And so we have to really find out, what they want and what they hope from this, given that their community was taken away to create what is there now. So, just to know, it wasn't always what it is now. They had to take down housing to do that. So, we will engage with the community side by side, and hopefully that will be relevant to the discussion. But that I'm going to do that. So, that there's no way that I'm not. So,
Thank you, Sarah.
yeah.
Anything else? Okay, Tom, last one.
One more project here. This. All right, so this is another EOA adjacent project that we are starting in the Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub in the Portland Harbor. I say it's EOA adjacent because it is specific to dealing with how we regulate new development at the bulk fossil fuel terminals. And because of that narrow focus, and that the EOA has a larger view, mainly looking at industrial land, and that this CI Hub project is mainly dealing with zoning code changes. We're not changing the industrial designation of the fuel terminals. Therefore, it doesn't really have an impact on the EOA itself. But because there's the overlap, we're dealing with an industrial use, it's in the North Reach. We just wanted to make you all aware of this separate project, separate process that is basically going to be going in parallel to the EOA. Just again, for situational awareness of what is going on with this project. And so I'll get in just to catch everybody up, talk about what is the CEI Hub, just some highlight on the different agency roles and responsibilities, and then where we are planning to go with this project. So the CI Hub itself is the area in the Portland Harbor, in the Northwest Industrial District along Highway 30. It encompasses 11 different fossil fuel terminals, the tank farms that are out there, and then all of the associated elements, the pipeline connections and the marine docks that come with those uses. There we go. And so this area where we have these terminals also coincides with areas that are at high risk of liquefaction during an earthquake. And create a lot of risk associated with especially in a major Cascadia eruption zone earthquake, which is really what we are trying to solve for in this area. Why is there we go. And so our approach to date has been to really try and figure out how to balance the need for liquid fuel for not just Portland, but these terminals serve 90% of the fuel needs for the state of Oregon, and balancing that with if we were siting such facilities today, this would not be a good place to put it because of the risk of liquefaction. And then at the same time managing a transition away from fossil fuels, over the next 25 to 30 years. And so what we want to do is look at how we limit the growth of these facilities, and yet at the same time make them safer. And again, what we've defined as a bulk fossil fuel terminal are the larger facilities. They have some sort of outside regional connection. So they have a pipeline connection or a dock or a rail line. And then they have a large amount of fuel tank storage, more than 2 million gallons of storage. And what we've done so far and what is currently in the zoning code is for these facilities that they cannot add additional fossil fuel storage capacity. They can reuse what they have, but they can't add more for fossil fuel with some exceptions. And the two major exceptions are an allowance for aviation fuel, because that is the one type of fuel that forecasts seem to indicate a need for additional increased consumption over time, and then for renewable fuels to aid in that transition. And so the purpose of this project is to actually go back and look at the comprehensive plan policies related to these uses, and then look at the zoning code regulations themselves to see how we can further limit development of this fuel infrastructure. And that's sort of the conversation that we're going to be having, starting this month and extending over the summer, and then again, sort of getting a proposal in front of Planning Commission this fall, and then to City Council early in 2026. But that is what I had to share with you. Again, this is designed to be more of a situational awareness of similar to Daniel's infrastructure code project. But we'll just pause there for any questions you might have.
Will you guys email out all these reports that you showed?
Yes, we'll as we have in the past, we'll post a recording of this meeting and all of the slide decks for these individual projects.
Where will you post that? I don't.
On the EOA website has individual meeting events where we post all of the materials for that. Okay. We'll send, once they're posted, we'll send out a link to everybody.
Stretch.
Home stretch. All right. Yeah. So we have this one is about the EOA. And this is what we're calling the Industrial Edge Policy Project. And this really comes out of emerging issues about that, and we got started looking taking a closer look at this issue about a year ago in response to Commissioner Rubio had proposed a resolution, a council resolution to take a closer look at specific to warehouses, but industrial uses along what we call that are adjacent to residential areas in the city. And so we've started to pull together some thinking about how would we approach that issue. It by its nature implies additional regulation and impacts to industrial uses, and therefore it is part of the EOA and going forward. And so this is sort of a new policy option alternative that we will begin to incorporate into this EOA work. And so we just wanted to share with you this morning how we're going about that work, what kinds of issues we're looking to address. Next slide. And so what we want to really look at is that interface between the industrial areas and the residential areas, and then come up with an approach to better address the impacts that those industrial uses can have on those industrial areas, and the residential areas, yes. And so, we really want to come up with an approach through this process. Again, through the EOA, we're really, it's going to be more similar to the Northreach process. It's going to be an issue identification process for which, after the EOA is adopted, we will, really get into developing, doing a code project that will develop the specifics around what types of regulations we're talking.
Yeah, I see a couple hands up. Are they clarifying questions? Because I think we'd like to let Tom at least sort of lay out the framework of conversation.
I have a relevant comment. So.
Okay. How about you, Corky? Wait.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
So I think this is where I'm going to turn things over to Julia.
No, I actually would like to make a comment. This is John Isaacs.
Okay, sorry, John.
I appreciate it. I'll make it quick. this is an example of what I was talking about earlier. So this was a policy proposed by a city commissioner. It was never adopted. There was a bill in the state legislature this session on this that had so much opposition, it didn't even get a hearing. So what I asked for earlier is for you to transparently let us know when we're getting into optional discussions versus what we're required to do within the EOA. So this isn't even a policy that's been adopted anywhere. It was proposed. So to me, this is like at the furthest edge of optional. I'm not against having a discussion about it. I just would like you to identify when we're getting into things that are not required under the economic opportunities analysis. Okay, thank you.
Hey, Sean, maybe just keep providing that context.
Yep. All right, Julia.
Yeah. So yeah, again, we're kind of just introducing this project, introducing what kind of some preliminary thoughts about what an industrial edge policy would look like. So just to step back a bit, just describing what the industrial edge is, it's just areas in the city where industrial zonings abut residential zoning or sensitive uses, essentially just areas where the zoning does cite often incompatible uses near each other. The table you see here in the slide shows a preliminary list of what the two sides would potentially consist of. But these again are not final lists. You might notice that, for example, EX, which is a central employment zone, is not in here. That zone allows for both uses, so we're not entirely clear whether this would be included in this definition of industrial edge. So there's a lot to contemplate still, but as we essentially move forward in a more formal project process, this would be something that we would be defining. But generally, for the purposes of today's EOA discussion and discussing the industrial edge, this is how we are defining the edge of the industrial edge. We did a spatial analysis on where that edge exists. So that hashed area is really just kind of highlighting that line edge between the zones we just talked about. There's about 68 miles of industrial edge. Most of that edge exists in the northwest, northeast areas, and the industrial sanctuary areas. And then there are some dispersed areas, namely along I-84 and 82nd. We have Brooklyn Yards, and then southeast Portland. There are some pockets near Brentwood, Darlington, Southlands, Pleasant Valley, kind of along the spring water corridor. So as part of this, again, this preliminary analysis of what this policy might look like, we wanted to try to learn more about who lives near the edge. For now, we're just kind of looking at units. We haven't really yet done an in-depth demographic analysis on who exactly lives in a 1,000-foot buffer, which we've identified on this map. But again, that could be a part of a more formal, as we go into the more formal process of a project like this. But for now, we're just looking at units and found that within 1,000 feet of industrial employment zone areas, about 25% of Portland housing units exist there. And these are just some numbers we're pulling preliminarily to start illustrating the reach of impact that might be happening in those edge areas. Of that 25%, about 2/3 of the units are located in residential only zones. The other third are in mixed use zones. And then you'll see that about close to a half of those units in mixed use zones are in the central city area. And I point that out just because central city is unique and complex in its mix of uses and zones. So, this might be an area that might ultimately introduce some exemptions around this policy. And the industrial edge issues, when you look at nationwide trends, they are often an environmental justice issue. So we pulled in our economic opportunity assessment for this, again, preliminary analysis, and found that about 1/3 of the units in that 1,000-foot buffer are in an economically vulnerable census tract. Again, this doesn't really paint the complete picture of the type of households that live near the edge, and we tend to do a more in-depth analysis of communities that may be disproportionately impacted by these by living in closed into the industry. But just for now, we wanted to point out some of the analysis that we would do when it comes to understanding, again, who is living in these areas. So as we began just exploring what this policy might look like, we started creating a list of just policy considerations. So we've broken that down into 2 steps. First, we ask ourselves, what properties would actually qualify under this policy? Again, that's not defined yet, but these are some questions we have been mulling over. What characteristics of a property make it subject to new policy regulations? Again, what zones or what uses are on either side of that coin? Which ones are we targeting under the new policy? Which ones would trigger the new policy to apply to nearby properties? So again, just defining defining the industrial edge, trying to make that more of an understood definition. And once we've defined that, then we ask ourselves, okay, are we trying to apply regulation to properties that are directly adjacent to sensitive uses or residential zones? Are we talking about properties within a distance of these residential zones and uses? Obviously, that's a very different relationship. And also, of course, we need to determine, what properties might be exempt from this. We wouldn't want to blanket statement apply this to everything, given that there are differences in intensities of development in these areas. So, would those exemptions be based on where they are? Would they be based on their proposed building size, lot size? These again are kind of brainstorm of ideas on how we might approach answering, this question for this policy. The second step is to understand, if a property does qualify, then what happens? What standards and regulations would apply to those properties that qualify? So first of all, we need to determine first if the proposed use is, the proposed use that is qualifiable, is it limited or is it prohibited? This is based on, again, on a lot of different policies we've seen around the country, that some uses that are more intensive are prohibited, some of them are more just limited. If they're just limited, what is being regulated, what is being limited exactly? And then the other question is also, what regulations apply to properties that are adjacent versus properties that are within a distance? There's a difference in terms of, again, the relationship of those properties. So what might be appropriate regulation for adjacent properties probably isn't appropriate for ones that are within a distance. And this is just a set list of standards and regulations, again, that we often see come with these industrial edge policies and regulations. Some of these actually already exist in the zoning code, but I think part of this project potentially is to look how to further to understand if those are actually making an impact, and how to evaluate those and see if there are other things that could apply here. So these are just, a long list of questions and thoughts that we're wrestling with and thinking through with this type of policy. I'm going to send it back to Tom to talk about who would be impacted on the industrial and employment zone.
Yeah, so we've looked at it from sort of thinking about that line and looking at both a 500-foot and 1,000-foot buffer to look at, on the sort of industrial side, who's impacted. Next slide, please. And so first, just in when we're just looking at all industrial land, in terms of who's impacted, we have about almost 40% of our industrial land falls within that outer 1,000-foot buffer. So it's a pretty significant amount. And what you see in the four columns here are the different industrial geographies that we've been looking at. So the dispersed industrial are what Julia was describing as some of those isolated pockets of industrial land that are scattered about. East Columbia is sort of east of the airport along Airport Way and between Sandy Boulevard and the river. Harbor access lands is that that's immediately adjacent to the Portland Harbor. And then the harbor and airport districts are all that other upland that wraps around through Rivergate and down out towards the airport. Next slide, please. And then within those two buffers, the 500-foot and the 1,000-foot buffer, we looked at the buildable land inventory. And again, half of our buildable land falls within that outer 1,000-foot buffer. So this can be a potentially significant impact on economic development in those areas. Next slide, please. And so in terms of what we're trying to do here and account for what we're trying to do is account for a future decision in this EOA, so that when we work out all the details and we figure out what the buffers are and what uses are impacted and what development standards are, we don't have to then go back and redo the EOA to account for those impacts, which is sort of the problem that Bob was highlighting all along when we did this back in 2016. In order to do the Columbia Corridor E zone project, we had to update the EOA, and that's where we find ourselves today. So what we're trying to do is incorporate into the EOA, anticipate a future decision on this issue, create a budget or enough room within this EOA to account for that future decision, but work out all the details later after we adopt the bill. And so what we've started to build into the scenario analysis policy options that look at sort of what you just saw. What are potential impacts of a 500-foot buffer or a 1,000-foot buffer? That's like this. And so and the way we're approaching this is much in the way we do with E-zones, is that there is some sort of constraint, regulatory constraint factor that gets applied to those lands within those buffers. And we'll look at that impact. And this becomes yet another policy option that we incorporate into the scenarios and talk about that impact. And incorporate that into the EOA. And then again, we'll work out the details later after we adopt the EOA. And I think that's what we have on this for now. Again, in July, when we get to looking at the scenarios, you'll see this pop up and be a policy option that we put into the mix with the E-zones and the North Reach and tree preservation and infrastructure investment and brownfields. That this will all be part of that mix. So, questions?
Yeah, well, hold on.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
Yeah, Corky's been waiting for a bit, so I'll let it, Corky ask his question or make his comment. You're muted, Corky.
Tom, I hear what you're saying, and I'd probably be doing the same sort of thing myself. But I will say I'm concerned that when you talk about kind of accounting for future decisions and working out the details later, the details are so often, of course, what really count. So I'm, interested to hear more about it, but concerned that we could end up creating a situation where there's more legal fights rather than fewer, and that bothers me. I'd like to real quick go back to the very beginning of this, because you're talking about some of the reasons for this, including traffic, heat islands. I'm not sure you had noise on there, but oh yeah, you did have noise. Good. I was going to add in noise, but the first one, concentrated emissions from idling trucks. Please, as you move forward on this, look at the data. Find the scientific data on it about what's coming out of the tailpipe and compare that to, Portland in general. What's our air quality in Portland? What's coming out of the tailpipe? And I think what you're going to find is what's coming out of the tailpipe is about the same, but actually a little bit better than the Portland air quality for any truck post 2012, anything built after 2012. So just please be data driven on that. Don't assume that a tailpipe is bad, because when it comes to toxic emissions, well, get the data. The other thing is, go to slide 4, please, because I think this is something important for the city to kind of embrace as you move forward on this effort. See that green area at the top? Actually, in the kind of the bottom right there, I believe that spot right there, and then another diagonal strip that's off this slide that looks a bit like the green at the very top of this slide. Those are 2 parcels that are privately owned. And I think a year ago, we came to the city and said, we have the landowner that wants to give the city this green space. They want to hand it to you for free, right? That green space you see right there, right? And it is, by the way, immediately adjacent to city-owned property, which is also a green space right there. The idea being that there's a land transaction going on nearby. These people own this property. It's a buffer zone. It's a perfect buffer zone. You've got residential to the south. You've got railroad and industrial to the north. Keep it a buffer zone. And here's the land for free. And the city said, no, thank you. Because they correctly said, there's long-term costs associated with that land ownership. My point here is, as you move forward on this, please think about what the city can do. Here's a perfect example. My God, we're handing you buffer zone. And you're saying, yeah, nah, thank you. I'm not going to bother with it. I find that appalling, and I think that kind of thought process should be included in this project. Think about what the city can do in partnership, to move forward on this effort of softening that industrial edge. That's all I got for right now.
Good ideas and points of wisdom. Corky, Benton, I see your hand up, but there was another question in the room that I'm going to take, or question or comment. So I'm going to go, was it, okay, thank you.
Well, I was actually just for Sam, in our pillar project, did we have any parcels that would be within these?
Most likely.
It would be interesting, just the same way that we are analyzing the costs of development, to incorporate some of the proposed buffer zone schematics. So
Thank you. Good advice. Ways to see how these layers match. Benton, hi, welcome.
Hi, sorry I was late, but appreciate all this. I'm going to be a little bit more direct than Corky was. I think it's highly inappropriate for us to engage in a policy that at present doesn't have any kind of legislative backing and movement in the existing EOA conversation. And one way I would think about this is we could do this with any number of policies going in any number of directions, right? We could do this with an expansion of industrial land if we chose to. We wanted to think about existing city policy or existing city planning that would say we're going to invest in industrial lands instead. And so I think that us kind of playing this what if game on something that we don't have a clear idea is moving forward as policy and is going to be passed is something that we should not be doing in this existing thing. And I think, Tom, you made the point about what Bob used to say about having to open up the EOA. That's actually part of the point, is that if you want to make a policy change that could be this impactful, you should have to go back to the EOA and figure out what is the impact going to be when you make that decision. And so for us to make it now, as if this is going to happen, I think is getting the cart way in front of the horse with city council and the mayor and the administrative office, instead of getting the core policy done first.
You, Benton. And I think that relates also to John's earlier comment as well. Yeah, Micah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to take this opportunity to, I think, do what Bob would have done and make a couple statements. I think to start, I don't want to downplay or minimize the concerns we've heard from PMC and from Columbia Corridor and others about the overall economic decline and the fear that of what that could be for Portland, our residents. And I share those concerns. And I also share the concerns about immediate or near future ecological collapse and resiliency collapse. And I think those two things need to continue to be paired together. And so I human health, salmon recovery, bird population decline, and livability are all things that, I think that they're the reason why Bird Alliance and others have been engaged in this EOA process, because economic opportunity analysis has all of these implications on those things, on human health. And I think a project like this is exactly trying to solve this conflict that we've had of industrial uses and their adjacency to our lowest income residents and our closest proximity to our existing natural resources. And so it's really important that we look at this dynamic and consider it and consider the ways that this sort of this planning process could help solve some of those problems that maybe as part of a compromise increases industrial intensity outside of those 1,000 foot areas and also increases environmental protections within those 1,000-foot industrial area or 1,000 feet with in adjacency to residential properties. And so I think this is sort of exactly the sort of planning process that should be incorporated into this process. Yeah, like on the, and as we go back to some of these other plans that are being incorporated, whether that's the FEMA BIOP, whether it's the PICM, like both of those processes are focused on reversing the ecological collapse of our salmon runs, and thus need to be considered within as a driving force of why we need to think differently about the EOA. I guess lastly, I'll add that in addition to like industrial edge as a scenario that we should be thinking about, we also need to continue to think about like pushing for an exemption to Goal 9 requirements that force upon us this impossible, impossible sort of engagement and trying to find new lands that we can't. We are a constrained city that cannot make up new lands. And for us to continue to be forced to find new industrial lands, it's just within our city is an impossible feat when we're considering the other, the other goals of protecting our residential communities, recovering salmon, like respecting the environment. We need to continue to consider that Goal 9 exemption push for a city like Portland. And at the same time, focus on intensifying jobs and not the archaic focus on acreage. We need to be focused on finding ways to incentivize density of jobs in close proximity to our metro area. Get off my soapbox.
Thank you, Micah. It's another good broad perspective coming to the table. Corky, we have 3 minutes, so I'm going to give you just a minute and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on that. And I think in the spirit of trying to be productive as we move forward here. One is, yes, we do want to increase intensity of jobs, acre intensity, which is how you do that is an urban growth boundary and have those jobs available in toward the core of the city. What we've got right now, let's not take that away. Two, if we are not asking for expansion of industrial land, we're asking for trying not to take away more than we're already taking away. We have such a limited supply. Please don't get rid of more of it. Three, yeah, we actually do have some land nearby that we could use for industrial purposes called Sophie Island. Really don't want to go there, but when we limit the amount of use of our current industrial land, it forces us as a city to start thinking about other places. Thanks.
All right, thanks for being provocative, right? It's the night.
Yeah, it's a little provocative. Sorry.
It's not our land.
To be discussed at a later date. I'm going to hand it over to Tom to wrap things up.
Well, I will just say, and our next meeting is June 11th. This time it is a Friday afternoon meeting. And to what Patricia was saying at that meeting, we want to focus really on the city actions to support economic development in the other parts of the city, the central city, the neighborhood commercial districts, even our residential areas. We have a lot of home-based businesses and actually quite a few jobs in those residential areas. And it sort of speaks to we're bumping up our limits in the industrial area. And so how do we realize our other economic opportunity, our other job growth elsewhere in the city? And what do those actions look like? What kind of investments can we make? What can we do to support small businesses? Those are all opportunities. We don't, in those areas, we don't have as much of a zoning capacity problem because you can go up. And we have a different kind of problem. We have lots of vacant space, lots of vacant office space downtown, lots of vacant retail space in our neighborhood commercial districts. So what is it that we can do to activate those spaces and fill them with jobs? that continue to create the economic opportunity here in Portland. And so we wanted to have a focused discussion about those areas before we get back to some of the harder policy choices in the industrial area. Because as Patricia said, the EOA covers the entire city. And so we wanted to zoom out a little bit and look at those other areas.
Great, thank you.
All right.
So that'll be June 6th, 1 o'clock.
Is it June 6th?
It is. Isn't it
June 6th. Yeah, I'm sorry. I got June and July mixed up. So yes, June 6th.
June 6th,
Quickly.
1 o'clock. For the meeting person, I'll be at the same here. And look forward to it. Really appreciate you all being here and your thoughts and comments. It'll be worked out.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.